This is kind of messy. This was just as I was thinking about talent is so complex and something we don't fully understand. I mean, you've got two advanced degrees in psychology, and it's definitely not nearly as hard of a science as, say, the material science of engineering a bridge. Is that a fair enough
Fair
statement?
enough statement.
I mean, we are learning how to define talent. We're learning, the vocabulary. We're
Right.
learning how, which things can change over time and which things can't be changed over time. We're continually learning that. So, and we really, I would say we don't have even an idea of how far along we are. We know how long we've been working the problem and we know the gaps in
Right.
it, but we don't know what the end looks like.
Right.
So just knowing that talent is far messier than engineering a project. And I know that's one of the struggles for me is I wish that talent was as easy as building a project. And building a project is hard. I'm not dismissing that, but building people is incredibly hard. So I'm going to do my best to describe as I was thinking about, different dimensions of talent, and there's no one best dimension, and they're all nuanced in how they go together. But even something like a bar of gold, which I'm sure all of us would love, there's a lot of different ways to describe it.
Right.
If you say, how big is a bar of gold, or how do you describe it? There's size, and then size could come down to, width, length, thickness. Do you use, the imperial system, or do you use the metric system? Is it millimeters or is it inches? There's volume, so how big, there's weight. Weight's probably the one that we all go to because there's a market value for the weight that we describe, but that market value happens to be for a bar of gold as of April 2023 is about $64,000. If that were turned into jewelry, the price goes up exponentially, up towards priceless. If it's a survival situation and I happen to be on a desert island all alone, like Castaway or something like that, it pretty much goes down to somewhere to valueless to it could also be a burden if I had to carry that thing with me. It's a lot of extra weight. I could carry water, with that same amount of weight. So value depends on, and I think especially with talent, when you're looking at a person and what they can do, they might have been very, very successful over here and very, very high value, but in this organization over here, the way the roles are defined, the way the organization is where it's at, they're just not as valuable in
Right.
that, and the reverse can be true. So it's kind of, that's why I settled on the bar of gold. And I came up with, like, kind of four things that I was thinking of don't mix up vocabulary, words, and dimensions, like millimeters, centimeters, inches. They're all the same. They're the same dimension of linear distance. They are all different, though. They're all slightly different. So don't mix up vocabulary, words, and dimensions, and really dig in to understand what you really mean by that. So, like, when your prior slide, when you were talking about competencies, get back to say, okay, but why? Why does that really matter? What is that? How do we measure that? How are we measuring it with our current people? What's the standard? What's above standard? What's below standard? How does that relate to delivering outcomes on our projects or whatever the role happens to be? Knowing, too, like, talent has a lot more dimensions. They're all imprecise measurements. You cannot measure talent nearly as precisely, though you can measure my height and weight. But I'm not going to talk through that one right now. There's lots of overlapping vocabulary words in, when it comes to talent. Like, we just kind of dissected that, skill, the difference between a skill, a competency, and a capability. We talked about the difference between training and development. And by the way, if you look up any of these definitions, you will find a bunch of conflicting,
Right.
even in those
Right.
definitions we just gave. So what's important is, when we're working through the talent value stream with clients, or just internally, if you're working through it, define what they mean to you and what they don't mean, and go with that definition. It doesn't, you don't have to worry about the outside world. You just have to know what they mean to you. And then not all dimensions matter equally for a given role or stage of growth. Like, for instance, if I am just trading gold on the open market, I really don't care what shape that gold is in. I mean,
Right.
I just don't. I care about the weight and I care about the purity, and those are the big variables. The 99% variables. If we talk about prioritization, and how it's shaped doesn't really matter. And knowing, for that, unlike that bar of gold, which if I bury that bar of gold and I dig it up 20 years from now, it's pretty much going to be exactly the same. It doesn't degrade when it's in the ground or anything like that. people and companies both massively change over time. So somebody that was a great fit today and a star A
Hmm.
performer may not be a star A performer as the company sits 10 years from now, and vice versa. So anyhow, those that's how I was thinking about dimensions of talent and all that. Now you're the one with that's an electrician's view of that. You're the one with the advanced degrees. How does this sit with you? How do you see it similarly, differently, all that?
Yeah, well, I certainly look at it in a very similar bent, right? Is that there really is no one best dimension. People are messy. They can't necessarily be predicted because there's so many outside forces, right? When people show up for work, they bring their whole selves, whether their morning went great or not. I think what's probably the best thing to pull from here is that realize that just because somebody measures in millimeters or centimeters on one scale, that inches on another scale is totally fine. You may use inches, they may use centimeters. It's not a big deal. Just make sure that if you're inside the same organization and you're having the same conversations, that you have a common language. Language is probably, David, just like you were saying, right? Language is probably where we get messed up the most. We think we know what the other one's talking about, and it turns out we do not have a clear and transparent definition that everybody can buy into. So, of all the things, and to me, and we'll get to a lot of this next time, is in those role definitions and role transitions is the clear communication of what you're talking about. So there's no one right answer. There's just a right answer for you and your company, right?
Yeah. So if you're choosing dimensions, like personally, I give my running times in meters just because it sounds much better to say 10,000 meters rather than to say 6 miles. It just sounds better. That's all. So
I like it. Take the win. Take the
yeah.
win.
And if you give if people are thinking about miles per hour or something like that, and I give the time in kilometers, and it just sounds like I'm so much better than I am. So it is important to dig into, like, okay, what is that? All right. So joking aside, no perfect models or tools, though there are a lot of models. We talked about this before with the contractor business model, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And there's a variety of them, I mean, from Clifton strengths through DISC stratified systems theory. There's physical performance tests. There's a technical hard skill test. There's all kinds of models and tests. You have to know what you're using
Mhm.
it for, and make sure that you're using something that is going to go help you either predict the performance of somebody that's moving into a current role, or help design their development path forward. But it's like, and don't just assume that it's some degree of wrong,
Right.
and that there's multiple dimensions to it. So I think in this, when you're evaluating people, because really if you're in this recruit to hire, you are evaluating people and you're selecting people, and it's really important to know, be clear that you're evaluating a person's fit for your project team and company at a moment in time. And can they meet the performance standards for the role after their onboarding, training, and integration period? That's really what you're trying to do. And possibly looking at them for the future. Do they have the skills, aptitude, and desire for future roles? You're not evaluating them as a person, but also be really sensitive, and I'm talking to myself in this, of how the other person may feel in that relationship, because it is hard if you're going in and you're putting yourself out there and you're saying, I'm applying for this job. Let's face it, that's probably something that they're looking at you and you're evaluating them.
Right.
And so just know that's a dynamic to be sensitive to. It can actually mess up the results. Some people get very, very caught up in it. It can mess up the results, so to speak, of the evaluation.
Right.
So, again, so this is where you have a lot more training, and you geek out over this. I love how you think about talent. So what more do you have to add on this one?
Well, the one ad is full disclosure, Clifton Strengths geek, right? Certified coach, find that stuff incredibly fascinating. And David, you and I were talking about it earlier today that yes, you're evaluating that person's fit in the organization. Just also remember that every person, based on the Clifton Strengths research, is that you are one in 34 million. When you look at the themes that come through Clifton Strengths, the chances of having your strengths in the same order as another person on the planet is one in 34 million. So does the hiring manager have a heck of a job to go do? Yes, they do. Because they're not just looking at a bank of people, they're looking at every single individual and how they're going to fit into this organization. Do they have the requisite skills? What does that look like? So it's harder than people think it is.
Yeah, and it doesn't define the whole of a person. It defines a series of dimensions about that person, but it doesn't
Right.
define their hard skills or their experience or what their desires are or anything like that. Or else you'd only have like 10 project managers on the planet or something like that. If it was you had to have this perfect sequence of Clifton strengths in order to be able to do the job. So anyway, it's one as you get into it. And I would say that the word of caution is when you go to like if you go to predictive index training or DISC training, a lot of times those companies they've grown and they've scaled and they're very proud of their research and their analysis and confirmation bias comes in. So it starts to narrow down to where you start to think that this one system defines everything and it can predict all these things. It can't.
Right.
So just know that if you're in there and you start to feel that way, you're some degree of wrong. Back yourself up and look at it, and really get back in, kind of like we were doing with the project management roles of like look at the specific task and just say, okay, what does it take to do this task? And really, I mean, a lot of tasks, it doesn't matter if am I an introvert, am I an extrovert, am I strategic, am I this or that. I mean, most tasks, it just doesn't really matter what you happen to be, or am I a over C if you use predictive index, or a D over I, or whatever if it's DISC. It just doesn't matter. So focus on the task, the job that needs to be done, and can they meet the performance standards for the
Right.
role, and then move on. So this gets into that prioritization aspect, like you were talking about
Yep.
earlier. So let's talk about the end of this. So we got the new budding, up and comer that's coming in, and we got the retired superintendent that's going out.
Yeah, yeah.
This is what your whole PhD's in, right?
Yeah, my dissertation is very much about those long-term, high expertise people, leaving the organization or leaving a big role for maybe something different. And really, this is all about taking that retiring employee, looking at what they've got in their head, right? That knowledge that's there, that uh, culture from the organization, and how you move that into a new role in the company, right? How you can offboard that information to others, and how you can also put that person in a new role. So, really, it's about when you look at taking someone from one role to the next, right? Depending on the size of the organization that you are, because all of these organizations, right, have these inflection points. What are you going to do? What is the different leadership focus as you move from the stage one organization to a two, a three, or from a five to a six? What does that look like? When we're looking at that leadership focus, if we paid attention, really paid attention to that offboarding, right? You've got that high expertise person, maybe a vice president, maybe a division manager, could be your CEO, right? It could be anybody there. If you're looking at having the conversations with them, what role would they want to do that would be a win for them, a win for the organization? How do you have those conversations? Because what it does is it actually helps the organization in several ways. One is it can smooth that cash flow, because you're not having maybe a high owner that suddenly needs a huge, takes a huge amount of cash out of the organization. So there's a way that they can offboard, maybe get their cash back out, Their salary may go down, things like that. So there's all sorts of ways to look at that. But as cash flow changes, you can see that the profit curve across those inflection points, right? They continue to occur at all of those that tripling of headcount. When you've got those offboarding people, they help to smooth that actual growth to something that maybe looks a little more like the ideal. It's never going to get quite there, but it helps to bridge all of those inflection points because you're not losing that knowledge from, let's say, from a stage 5 to a stage 6 organization. That knowledge isn't walking out the other side of the door. They are, again, maybe setting up programs with colleges for speaker options, getting in the classroom. They could be um, possibly getting into the legislation, right? Going and being that advocate for new types of legislation to increase work out, into the construction industry. They could be people that are just out there brand building, right? Being the speaker that can be for the organization. So there's a lot of things that can help to kind of smooth that growth when you've got someone who's willing to stay, who's willing to work with others in transferring and retaining that knowledge, that mission, that value, that culture, uh, be that kind of ambassador of the organization. So, David, I don't know if you've been through. I know you've been through several of those. Not sure how long they've gone or things that you've seen differently.
Oh man, yeah, we've been through quite a few successions, and there's succession at. I think a lot of people define succession at the ownership level, like, and we define that as very specifically an ownership transition. Like,
Right.
I think for us, we define succession as my ability to transfer the things that I was doing in my role and being able to transfer them to you, and then wherever I'm going, being able to move there. So that's succession, and when you really need to work through that at all levels, that's the organizational
Right.
development aspect that we're talking about. And then there's ownership transition, which is really a financial transaction. So there's two of those things going on at the same time. So
Right.
you have the succession in the role, and then you have the ownership transition. And yeah, I don't think any one of them has been exactly, they all have the same
Yeah.
principles of, like, you've got to transferring the wealth, from a transactional standpoint, is complex, but it is nowhere near as complex as transferring the skills, the knowledge, the wisdom of how to, and the relationships that were required to actually create that. So that's where the challenge comes from. But that isn't just at the ownership level. That can be at the superintendent level. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest gaps we're
Mhm.
seeing, is that how do you build and how do you lead, tens, hundreds, or thousands of people? That's a really big skill, to pass on. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, you're right. We've seen that 100 times. We don't have enough time for every one of those stories to go through that. We've seen it good and bad, and I think the bad is usually when I think about it, when I just think about what you're talking, it's when, let's say that I'm exiting, and then I'm over here and you've got this great plan for me, and you've planned for me to go train and coach these two or three other people. Like we have a general superintendent right now, and his whole role over the next year is just training two other people in the role, and
Right.
that's it. And he's just flying back and forth between two locations, and he's doing some fishing in between, and he's kind of enjoying his retirement masterpiece, and he's training and bringing up those two people. The challenge comes in when the and it comes from both sides, right? So if I'm that superintendent that's doing that, like, that sounded really good on paper, but then when I see these two people that I'm training, they're like in the middle of the action, and I love being in the action. I feel like I want to dive into the middle of the action. So that's the problem from the, let's call it, the offboardee.
That's right.
So
That's right.
they want to dive back into the action, and that can be the same as, like, if I progressed up a level in a role, instead of me embracing this role that I'm at, I'm still falling down, and I'm really focused on the role that I was doing before, which really hamstrings whoever my successor was in a lot of ways, and it hamstrings my ability to learn the new role. So there's 10 problems go on there. So that's a problem for them. And then the other problem is, from the external, from like the company's perspective, it's really easy for them to go, we're halfway through the training. It's going really,
Yep.
really well. And we just got this new project over here.
Yeah.
And so instead of going, all right, let's bite the bullet and we're going to go bring in somebody new or promote somebody a little bit earlier and we're going to have this superintendent, work on training them. Nope, we pull them right back
Yep.
out and put them right back into the fray. So we shortcut the training on the two people that he was working on, and then we put him right back into the fray. And then 6 months or a year goes by and he realizes why he wanted to retire,
Yeah.
to begin with. And
Exactly.
So that's where we see a lot of problems. It's the clarity of it's having the clarity of the plan and really working through that, which I know we spend a lot of time with, and then having the discipline to stick to it even as the conditions change. But also being flexible and knowing sometimes the conditions change and require a change to the plan.
Right.
So I don't know if that described it well, but yeah, I was thinking about that as you were talking through that.
Yeah. Well, and we
Um,
always laugh that it was, hey, we're training people, developing people, professionally and leadership wise. And the change in the schedule sometimes was, you know what? Sometimes you just got to take one for the team because things have changed
yep.
so rapidly and everything else. We will get back. It's more of a detour than a change. But yeah, you're right. Having the discipline to know that you're going to detour, but knowing you're going to pull back and finish what you started. So, yep, huge,
Yeah.
huge.
So, but there's a big difference